Hello, ambassadors and fellow Israel travelers and members of the class at Southwest that's looking at all the places that we're going to be visiting next April when we go to Israel together. I'm looking forward to that trip, and I hope you are too. We were really gratified by the response to the new class time this last Sunday morning. We've switched from having our class at 9:30 to having it at 8 o'clock with a following it with a worship service that's more of a traditional worship service with traditional music and having the message live stream from Auditorium 1. And it really went very well. We did have one problem, however, and that is because of the change of location, our equipment wasn't set up to record the video and audio of our class as well as we've been accustomed to. So I'm coming back and re-recording the thoughts about Caesarea Philippi that we visited last week in our Bible class. So if you're interested in taking a look at it and being able to see the slides a little better than you could in the video that we recorded during class, here it is. Caesarea Philippi was an impressive Greco-Roman city about 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee in an area known as the Golan Heights. It was located at the base of Mount Hermon, which is the highest peak in Israel. And in Bible times, there was a huge spring that was one of the major headwaters of the Jordan River that emerged from a cave at the base of the mountain. Now, the water's still there, but it has a different route that it takes now because of some seismic activity through the years. The city is about 3 miles east of Tel Dan, which is the place we'll visit just before we go to Caesarea Philippi. Tel Dan, you may remember, is the place where Jeroboam set up the golden calf for the northern tribes of Israel to worship. And the idolatry introduced by Jeroboam ultimately led to the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel. So when you look at maps of Israel, if you're looking at a map of Israel during the Old Testament times, you might see Dan, but you might not see Caesarea Philippi. If you're looking at a map of Israel during the Gospel times, you'll see Caesarea Philippi, but you won't see Dan. Because even though they're very close together, they really occupy different time periods. This is a look at how Caesarea Philippi is situated with respect to Capernaum and Bethsaida, two of the places where Jesus spent a good deal of his ministry. When you look at Matthew 16 and 17 and Mark 9 and 10 and Luke 9, the picture emerges that Jesus turns north from the Sea of Galilee to Caesarea Philippi before he turns south to go to Jerusalem to die. Now, the things that take place in those chapters are the feeding of the 5,000 at Bethsaida, which is just a few miles from Capernaum, the trip to Caesarea Philippi and Peter's confession there, and the Transfiguration, which I believe probably took place on Mount Hermon, even though tradition has it back on Mount Tabor, which is southwest of the Sea of Galilee along the eastern edge of the Jezreel Valley. I believe it took place at Mount Hermon because that follows naturally from Caesarea Philippi at the base of the mountain to Mount Hermon at the top, and it seems to fit the story better. The distance from Capernaum to Jerusalem was about 78 miles. But before Jesus headed south to Jerusalem, as Luke tells us in Luke 9:51, he first headed 37 miles north to Caesarea Philippi, to a place that he and the disciples never visited before. And since he had to retrace that 37 miles, essentially what you have is Jesus took a 74-mile detour by foot on a 78-mile trip. He essentially doubled the length of his trip to Jerusalem by going to Caesarea Philippi. There had to be a reason. Here's a Google Map illustration of how it works. Going north from Jerusalem, 78 miles, you come to the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, where Capernaum and Bethsaida are located. And then you go about 34 miles north from Capernaum, and you find Caesarea Philippi, located right at the base of Mount Hermon. I found a good video that kind of tells a little bit about the story and kind of sets up what we're going to talk about. It has to do with Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, and it's a video by Appian Media. I think you'll appreciate it.
So we've arrived at Caesarea Philippi, about an hour north of the Sea of Galilee.
Yes.
And walking up to it, this thing is just enormous. It's huge.
It really is a beautiful location, and there are a number of things here I want to show you.
This site has a lot of historical significance even prior to the time of Jesus.
Well, it does. It sits on an international highway between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And so there was a lot of traffic through here.
Okay.
People would come through the city, they would trade here, they would stay here, but they would also come here to worship. And what they worshiped was a grotto and temple dedicated to the god Pan, and that's where the name Paneas came from.
Okay.
Now, since then, the word has changed a little bit, and we now call it Bainea.
Okay.
Changed the P to a B. And this was set up by Herod Philip II, the son of King Herod.
Okay, so this is Herod the Tetrarch.
Mm-hmm.
We read about him.
Correct.
And in the same area, we also have something that was built in dedication to one of the Caesars, Caesar Augustus. And we don't know that it was exactly right here, but it was here in Caesarea Philippi, somewhere in the area.
That's correct. King Herod built 3 temples. One was here at Caesarea Philippi, there was another one at Caesarea Maritima, and there was another one at Samaria.
And we have examples of some of that. You know, we have some of these pillars, some of these capitals, but besides that, I mean, what most people come to see is the remains of those temples and the sacrificial site to Pan.
That's correct. And those are just up the hill over there.
Okay. So below us is what?
This is the Bainea Spring. It's one of the 3 rivers that lead into, they're the headwaters for the Jordan River.
Okay, so this connects with the Jordan a little ways down.
Yes.
Okay. When we first walk up, it's very peaceful. You've got one of the headwaters rolling by, but then when you turn the corner and go up the hill, it's just this stark red cliff face with temple ruins. The sun is baking you. Coming up here, we've got this cave with a big rock in it.
Right. Well, this is where the sanctuary of Pan once stood. The grottos are on up the hill here. The sanctuary used to sit right here, right in this grotto. There was water that flowed out of Mount Hermon down through here. And what they would do is they would bring a goat and try to sacrifice the goat, and they would throw the goat into the water. And if the goat sank, that was good. If it did not and it floated, that meant that Pan rejected their sacrifice. Unfortunately, at that point, the next sacrifice was a child, and so they would bring a child up here and throw the child into the water.
That's horrible.
Yes.
So at some point, this was all filled in. Water's
Yes.
not flowing out anymore.
No, it was all filled in. There was a huge building here, and the water would flow out and it'd flow down to the stream where we were below.
Okay. So this is the court of Pan, and we're walking up into this grotto area with a niche, with this shelf. What would have been put on this shelf?
They would put all kind of idols and other things dedicated to the god Pan on
Okay,
it.
now there are a lot framing this grotto on the outside as well, so those would have been filled
They would have been filled as well.
with statues and idols as
Yes.
well. So a very, very idolatrous place.
That's right.
Okay. So we've got this arch, the niche right there.
Yeah. And the temple would have come out from here and sat on this platform. Of course, a lot of it has fallen down over the years.
So this whole floor has sunken in.
Yes.
You were saying seismic activity in the area.
That's right. This is where a statue would have sat, here at the court of Nemesis. They would have had a huge temple right here for them to come up and worship.
You see niche after niche after niche where they had idol after idol after idol. You can just imagine the lighting that would have been there, the candles that would have been there, incense that would have been offered there. This was a huge deal.
Yeah, you see floors and columns and things that have, of course, fallen over over the years. That these used to be temples. These used to be sanctuaries. These are places where people would go and worship these idols. And that's what the city was known for.
So to see all of that just makes you realize how empty all of that idolatry was and how it didn't help the people who observed all of that. It didn't help the people to sacrifice the animals and their children. The niches are empty, the idols are gone, the floors are a mess, the columns are knocked over. That is not the answer. Idolatry is not the answer. And it didn't benefit those people in the least to worship those things. Normally when you come here and you're helping people understand why this is so significant, there's a specific passage that you like to read and explain.
I do. I think it's interesting that as Matthew wrote his gospel, there are some times in which he tells us exactly where things took place, and then there are other times in which he doesn't. For instance, the Transfiguration. We're not exactly sure where that took place. Or something like the Sermon on the Mount. We're not exactly sure where that took place. When he came to this story, he made the specific decision to tell us it happened at Caesarea Philippi. And I'm forced to ask the question, why? Let's read this passage here. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And I think Peter's response is so significant. If you look at Peter's answer and think about the role of the city and the nature of the city and the grottos and temples and everything that are up on the hill, what he's doing is drawing a distinction between the living God that Jesus is the Son of and the dead false idols here in Caesarea Philippi. And I think that's exactly why Matthew told us this event took place here.
So by going up there and seeing the temple to Pan, they're contrasting those dead idols with who Jesus is.
Correct.
Who he's claiming to be. Peter is saying that's who he now believes Jesus to be.
That's correct.
Being here and seeing that helps put all of that in perspective. It helps me visualize exactly what Jesus was trying to communicate, what he was trying to compare and contrast. I'm so glad that we came here to see all of that.
Absolutely.
For any Bible student, that text is probably one of the most critical or important pinnacle passages in the entire New Testament. And so to go to the place, the region where Jesus asks that question and Peter answers it is just huge. One of the things that you realize when you go to the site, this is a place where they're worshiping dead idols. This is a place where they're sacrificing animals to things that don't exist. And in some cases, they are sacrificing their children. They're sacrificing their sons to these things that don't exist. In contrast to that, the Son of the living God asking the question, do you realize who I am? I'm the Son that's going to be sacrificed. It just blows you away to realize the stark contrast. And so I think to be there, to have that explained, to be able to visualize that helps you appreciate how immense the question and how significant the answer is. This wasn't just a carpenter's son. This was the long-awaited Messiah, the anointed one. This was the promised deliverer of Israel and everyone else.
I'm Craig.
And I'm Stu, and we're the founders of Appian Media.
We really hope that you've enjoyed the content that you've just seen. This was only made available through the generous donations of so many of you.
We believe that the world should have biblically accurate, visually engaging content about the Bible, and it should be free for everyone.
We would encourage you to visit the membership page of appianmedia.org and consider becoming a reoccurring member. Everything that you donate to Appian Media is tax deductible.
However you decide to donate, we really appreciate your support.
Well, here's another picture of Mount Hermon and Caesarea Philippi from the air, and you can see Caesarea Philippi located right there at the base of Mount Hermon, and I've circled the place where that sacred cave, the Cave of Pan, is located. It's situated right at the base of Mount Hermon, and again, that's where the spring flowed out in the first century that flowed down the Bainea River, Bainea Spring, all the way down to the Jordan River. And the city was known as Paneas at some points in its history. It was a place of worship for the god Pan and other Greek and Roman gods. Today, the name is Bainea, with a B as opposed to a P. And the reason for that is that Arabs pronounce the B sound and they don't pronounce the P sound. That's just one of the idiosyncrasies of the way that they pronounce words. So here's another picture, again aerial from the south, and you can see the sacred cave, and below that the palace of Herod Agrippa II. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Another picture of the grotto, what's called Pan's Grotto, from the south. Now let's think a little bit about Pan. If you remember your history classes, Pan was the Greek god of fertility. And if you remember seeing pictures of him, he was half man and half goat. He had, from his torso up, the body of a man, from his torso down, the body of a goat. And he was associated with fertility. But there are some other things that he was associated with. He was associated with fear. We get our word panic from him. He was associated with frenzy, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And that's where we get our word pandemonium. Pan was a mischievous god. As far as the Greeks were concerned, he spent most of his time frolicking in the woodlands and chasing after nymphs, which were female demigods, and also animals like goats. His erotic nature was shown by the way the lower half of his body appeared goat-like, suggesting that he acted solely on primitive instincts. And so Pan spread both the concept of fear and attraction contagiously into the world. In spite of his frightful appearance, Pan had a persuasive and even an alluring quality about him. His seduction came in the form of his musical pipes. You may remember seeing pictures of Pan with his pipes. And that caused spontaneous and irrational behavior in people. So on the one hand, Pan was kind of repulsive, but on the other kind, he was kind of attractive. He represented two conflicting elements that rule primitive life: fear and temptation. And for that reason, Pan can be kind of considered a representation of other deceptive horned beings. Probably our concept of Satan as having horns comes from the old images of Pan back as a Greek god. Now, the cave that you're looking at was called Pan's Grotto. It was believed to be the entrance to the underworld. Now, the Greek word to describe the world of the dead, the underworld, was the word Hades. Sometimes we see it translated in our Bibles as hell. But Hades was the realm of the dead. It was the underworld, the unseen world. Now, to the Greeks, Hades was not viewed as a place of fire, but a place of darkness. And the idea is that Pan would retreat to Hades in the fall, and he'd hibernate there through the winter. Well, in the spring, worshippers of Pan then would arrive here at the cave, and they'd offer live sacrifices to arouse Pan. And they'd begin by throwing a live goat into the mouth of the cave. And at that time, the Bainea Spring flowed from that cave. So they'd throw this goat into the mouth of the cave. If the goat sank, that's great. That indicated that Pan had accepted the sacrifice. But if the goat floated, or if blood flowed out in the water, that indicated that Pan had rejected the sacrifice. And so at that point, they would throw a live child as a sacrifice, and they would do that until Pan accepted a sacrifice. Once that was done, it was believed that Pan had become sexually aroused. So he would come out of the cave and fertilize the world. In order to get him really aroused, there was a group of young women who were depicting the nymphs that he was supposed to consort with. And so there were also a group of dancing goats that were called the sacred goats that were brought out. And the nymphs began engaging in sexual acts with each other, and then with the goats, and then with the worshipers, who also engaged with the nymphs and also with the goats. And so what you've got is this huge orgy that involved flagrant fornication and even bestiality in the worship of this pagan god. No self-respecting Jew would ever go there, and yet this is where Jesus took his disciples in Matthew 16. Here's another picture of Caesarea Philippi from the east. This mountain was the site of a battle in 200 BC between the Ptolemaic general Scopas and Antiochus III the Great, who was the Seleucid general. Now, the Antiochus and Ptolemais armies are both breakoffs from the army of Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great died, he left no heir. And his empire was divided up among four generals. The only two that are really significant for the Bible land are Ptolemy and Seleucus. And so you have the generals Ptolemaeus, who occupied the area to the south of Israel, And you have Seleucus, who occupied the area to the north and east of Israel, and they formed the two nations, or the two great parts of the Greek Empire that vied for control of the Levant, that area that Israel occupies along the Mediterranean Sea. So this was a place of constant conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Well, in the 1st century BC, Paneas was pressured on all sides. You had Aristobulus the first in Galilee, you had the Itureans, the Nabateans, and then you had the Seleucids on the north, you had Armenians, and Paneas was constantly under attack and being controlled by one nation or another from all around. Well, the Roman general Pompey granted control of Paneas to Ptolemy, the Tetrarch of Iturea, toward the end of the 1st century BC. And Ptolemy's son was executed by Mark Antony, and the territory was given to Cleopatra, who was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. And in turn, she leased it back to the Iturean chief Zenodorus. Well, by 20 BC, all of the trouble between Octavius, who became known as the Emperor Caesar Augustus, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra, by 20 BC, that had all washed out. And Caesar Augustus gave this whole territory to Herod the Great. In exchange, Herod the Great honored Caesar by building him a white marble temple at Paneas known as the Augusteum. Well, when King Herod died, his kingdom was divided among 3 of his sons. Herod Philip established his capital here at Paneas in 3 BC, and he renamed the city Caesarea to honor Caesar and Philippi to honor himself. So Caesarea Philippi. Well, in 39 AD, which is shortly after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, Caligula granted Herod Agrippa I, Herod the Great's great-grandson, his grandson, the territories of Herod Philip, and gave him the title king. And after his death, Paneas temporarily came under the jurisdiction of the province of Syria. But then when Herod Agrippa II came to the throne, he was given the territories again by Rome, and he made Paneas his capital. And he constructed a lot of buildings and monuments. We're going to see a palace that he built here in a few minutes. In 61 AD, Agrippa II refounded Paneas, and he changed its name to Neronius in honor of the Emperor Nero. That name didn't last. But the city was such a luxurious city that it was a place that Romans loved to come and visit. In fact, the general Titus, who was to become the Emperor Titus, spent a good deal of time here celebrating his victory over the Jews in 70 AD. And Josephus says that during the time he was there, a great number of captives were destroyed, some being thrown to wild beasts, and others in multitudes forced to kill one another as if they were enemies. Well, Herod Agrippa II died during the reign of Trajan early in the 2nd century. And subsequently, Paneas became a much less important town, even though it was still regarded as a city. Here's a Google Earth view of some of the locations of the archaeological digs in Caesarea Philippi, or Bainea. The ones that are of importance to us are the Palace of Agrippa. That's Herod Agrippa II, who's the great-grandson of Herod the Great. And the Grotto, which is the main street of the city. That's a feature of Roman cities. There's always a long, straight street that's lined with columns on each side, and it leads to the sacred district. And so the Grotto is that main street that runs toward the temple area that we've seen and that we'll look at a little bit more. And then, of course, there's the Grotto of Pan, which is where the temple district is. Now, remember the genealogy of Herod the Great. Herod the Great had a wife named Mariamne, along with other wives, but Mariamne was the mother of 2 sons, Aristobulus and Alexander. Well, Mariamne was executed by Herod the Great in 29 BC because he believed she was plotting against him. That was something you see a lot of back then. And later on in 7 BC, he had her two sons, Aristobulus, who's listed here, and Alexander, who's not shown because he never came to power. He had those two sons executed for conspiring against him as well. Well, then he died. He died in Caesarea Maritima, and after he died, his kingdom got divided. Now, Aristobulus is dead, so Herod the Great's kingdom was divided among his four sons, and his three sons, and Herod Agrippa I got the part that would have gone to his father Aristobulus. Well, Herod Agrippa I, you may remember, is the king that died in Caesarea Maritima, whose death is recorded in Acts chapter 12. We talked about that when we went to Caesarea Maritima in our studies several weeks ago. And that was Herod the Great's grandson. Well, Herod Agrippa II is the man before whom Paul made his defense in Acts 25 and 26. And he's the king whose palace is found here at Caesarea Philippi. Again, here's a picture of the temple district focusing on the Grotto of Pan. This is what an artist's conception of the city looked like in the 1st century AD. You can see it's quite a bit different than the ruins that we have now. But this is the city of Bainea, or Caesarea Philippi, as it would have looked in the 1st century, looking toward the Grotto of Pan and the temple district. Here's an artist's conception of the temple district. Here's maybe a better representation of it. And from left to right, what this temple district occupied was the Temple of Augustus, or the Augusteum, and that's that big marble structure in front of Pan's Grotto. Pan's Grotto, of course, is the location of Pan's temple. Next to that is the court of Pan and the nymphs. This is where the worshippers of Pan and these females who were portraying the role of nymphs would engage in all kinds of immoral conduct to try to arouse Pan. Next to that, you have the temple of Zeus, and between that and the next temple that you see was the court of Nemesis. That was the Greco-Roman goddess of vengeance. And then you have the tomb of the sacred goats, which is where they buried the goats when they were dead. But in front of that, you have the temple of Pan and the dancing goats. And this is where the worshippers of Pan would engage in bestiality as a part of their worship of Pan. So you've got a place here that's not only filled with idolatry and revelry, but also the worst kinds of sexual misbehavior that we can possibly imagine. There's good reason to believe that Caesarea Philippi may have been the same location that we read about in the Old Testament in Judges and 1 Chronicles as Baal Hermon, or Baal Hermon, because it was believed that Baal, the Canaanite god, would emerge from this cave, from the underworld. And if indeed Baal Hermon was the Old Testament name of Caesarea Philippi, then it would have belonged to the tribe of Manasseh, as recorded in 1 Chronicles 5:23. I think that makes sense, because the whole idea of the Canaanite god arising out of this cave would seem to be a natural flow to the Greek god Pan arising out of this cave and all of the other idolatrous associations that are connected with this whole worship center. Another picture here of Caesarea Philippi looking at Pan's Grotto. Now, Herod's Augusteum would have been situated right at the bottom of this photograph here, where this telephone pole is. And the Augusteum was a white marble temple built by King Herod in honor of Caesar Augustus. And the temple is depicted on the coins that were minted by Herod Philip after the death of Herod the Great. There are actually 3 locations that people tend to place the Augusteum. I think the best site is the one that puts it right in front of the Grotto of Pan. Another look at the temple district from above, and yet another looking at it from alongside, so that you're looking along the temples toward the Grotto of Pan, where those two people are standing. Something else you'll see all over the walls of Mount Hermon here, that cliff, are the sacred niches. And what would happen is there would be statues to gods and goddesses placed in all of these niches. So this became kind of a complex where there was a worship of all kinds of gods going on. Now, during the period of the Hellenists, which is the Greek period, the city was resettled. It's a beautiful city. There's a lot of gorgeous wooded areas. The Bainea Spring is gorgeous, and it was believed that god Pan lived here. And so it became known as the city of Paneas. And they had this open-air sanctuary that was built for the god Pan right next to the source of water that exited the cave. Here's another picture of the idol niches. Adjacent to the sacred cave, there's this rocky escarpment with a series of niches that have been hewn into the rock. Statues of deities were known to be placed in these niches, as evidenced by depictions on coins that were minted back in the 1st century. Now, one particular niche housed a sculpture of Echo, who was the mountain nymph that was supposed to be Pan's consort. And there's another niche that housed a statue of Pan's father, Hermes, the son of the nymph Maya. And these inscriptions in the sacred niches mention the names of those who gave large donations to fund their development. Caesarea Philippi, or Banias, flourished during the Byzantine, Arab, Crusader, and Mamluk periods, but it lost its importance during the Ottoman Turkish era. Prior to 1967, in more recent history, Banias was located in Syrian territory, not far from the border with Israel. At one point, Syria attempted to prevent the waters of the Bainea Spring from flowing into Israel and the Jordan River. And if we walk alongside the Bainea Spring, you may have an opportunity to see an upended Syrian tank that dates back to 1967 and the Six-Day War. And this is a tank that overturned when the Syrians were retreating from the area, crushing all of the people that occupied the tank. It's still there, lying in the Bainea Spring, rusting. Caesarea Philippi has been under excavation pretty much consistently since 1986. There were excavations in 1986 to 1999, and they overlapped with excavations in 1988 to 1994, and then 1988 to 2000. And during this period of time, the various areas in the city have been excavated. It was designated a nature preserve in 1988. Here are the remains of that central street that I told you about, the Cardo, that main columned street that ran toward the temple district. Here's a picture of the ruins of Herod Agrippa II's palace. Now, the palace complex apparently occupied an area of over 100,000 square feet. The palace was over 400 feet long. That made it big even by modern standards. And there were round towers that were located on the south side and vaults on the east side that supported a second story. And it had all kinds of underground passages and even a basilica built underneath it. After the death of Herod Agrippa II, the palace was converted into a huge bathhouse. And they did have a Jewish population, as is evidenced by the fact that there was a synagogue there in Caesarea Philippi. Here's an example of Roman ingenuity. Not only did they develop aqueducts, as we've already seen at Caesarea Maritima, but they developed high-pressure aqueducts at Caesarea Philippi. One of the things you'll see as you go through Israel, especially these archaeological areas, is there are a lot of fragments that have been uncovered. And working in an archaeological dig is kind of like working on a huge jigsaw puzzle. You find all of these pieces and you wonder where they fit. And every once in a while you find out pieces fit together. And so they kind of have these places where you'll see all kinds of fragments laying around while they're trying to figure out exactly where they fit. And among those, you'll find things like this. There's a column with a Greek inscription on it. Or you'll find other stones with all kinds of geometric carvings on them. Caesarea Philippi is a beautiful area. There's an archway we may walk under that goes along the Bainea Spring. It leads us to the Bainea waterfall. Now, the waterfall is only about 30 feet high, but it's really impressive. It's divided into two streams because there's a tree that grows right at the top. And it's gorgeous in the fall when it's just about dry, but it's really gorgeous in the spring. And this is the way it looks. Kind of makes you think of Psalm 42, verse 7. Deep calls to deep in the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and breakers have swept over me. Well, the Bainea Spring is one of the four main springs that flow together into the headwaters of the Jordan River. It's the easternmost source of the Jordan River. Well, what is the point of Caesarea Philippi? Why did Jesus take that 74-mile detour before turning south and going to Jerusalem? Why did he do that? Well, I think it hinges on the question that he asked. Who is Jesus? Matthew 16. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Now, what was the point of Jesus' question? Who do people say that the Son of Man is? You know, Jesus' favorite designation for himself is Son of Man. So he's asking, who do people understand me to be? And he wanted to know how people outside of his circle understood the term in Daniel 7:14, the Son of Man, as it applied to him. I think that's the reason he brought the people to Caesarea Philippi. They're looking around at all of these gods, all of these depictions, all of this immorality and idolatry and paganism. And Jesus says, okay, where do I fit in this picture of the world's religions? What do people think about me? And their answer tells a lot about what people thought about Jesus. They say, one of the prophets. I mean, some people were expecting a series of prophetic forerunners to come in the last days before the Messiah. Some expected that the greatest prophets of the Old Testament era would return before the last days to usher in that age. And they thought that Jesus was one of the Old Testament prophets that had returned from the dead. Some people expected the Messiah to be the prophet that's mentioned in Deuteronomy 18:15-18. You know, Moses said, "A prophet like me." Some thought Jesus was a new prophet, and others thought he was a reincarnation of one of the prophets of old. But the idea was pretty consistent. They thought he was a prophet. That was what was common in all of the answers. So Jesus asks a second question. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." The question Jesus asked was intended to contrast the opinion of people who were outside of the circle of the disciples with the opinion that the disciples themselves had of Jesus. He turns away from the opinions of the general public, which had only casual contact with him, to ask his disciples the same question. They'd all left everything to follow Jesus. They'd been with him for some time. They'd seen everything he did. They'd heard what he taught. In light of all of this, how did they themselves view him? He wanted to elicit from his disciples a clear confession that he was the Christ. He also wanted to correct any misconceptions they might have about his role as the Christ. And so when Peter answered, he's speaking for the group. And you can always count on Peter to be the one to pipe up and give you the answer. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong. This time he was right. And so he appears to be ahead of the rest in comprehending who Jesus is. Jesus wanted from the disciples a clear confession that he was the Christ. What is the significance of the fact that Peter calls him the Christ and the Son of the living God? Well, taken together, the two descriptions form the most comprehensive expression of Jesus' essential being that's found in the Gospels. Christ designates him as Israel's leader, sent from God. And the Son of God describes his unique nature and his relationship to God the Father. In calling him Son of God, Peter recognized Jesus as a unique individual. He has a unique relationship with God the Father. It's unclear how much Peter may have understood and differentiated the two terms, but at least for Matthew's readers, Messiah was a functional title describing Jesus' saving activity, and Son of God means that he's more than just a human. It goes beyond the idea of Jesus being the Messiah or the Christ, which is the Greek word for Messiah, to describe who Jesus really is. As the Christ, the Messiah, Jesus was the one climactic figure in whom God's purposes would ultimately be accomplished. As the Messiah, he was the coming one that the Old Testament had foretold. He's the one who's going to usher in the Messianic age. He's the one who would transform the present order. But as Son of God, he's more than just a human. He's a manifestation of God in the flesh. He's God's agent who participates in God's own being. So to say that Jesus is the Son of God is probably the central and most important affirmation about him in this gospel, even though it's already been said about him before. It's not new to the readers of the gospel, but it's new as Peter and the 12 begin to have it dawn on them exactly who this Jesus is. What does it mean for God to be called the living God? Well, that distinguishes Israel's true God from these pagan false gods, these dead idols that are being worshipped here at Caesarea Philippi. He's the living God in contrast with the false gods of pagans, which are dead. But he's also the source of all life. God alone has life in himself and is able to impart life to others. So this title, the living God, distinguishes him from everything that the disciples are seeing here at Caesarea Philippi. He is the true God who is alive and active in the world and in Israel's history. He's the one to be reckoned with. He's the one who works with divine power in earthly situations. He's the only God who is alive, and he lives forever. Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," that means son of John. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." There's been a lot of question about exactly what was meant by "you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church." What is the rock upon which Jesus promised to build his church? Well, there's a play on words here, and it comes to light especially when you look at the very image of what the disciples and Jesus are looking at when this whole exchange takes place. When he says, "You are Peter," the name Peter is in Greek Petros, Petros is the way we would spell it. It's a masculine noun, but the word itself, Petros, refers to a rock, like a stone or even a boulder. It may not be a pebble, it may be a good-sized rock, but it's a rock that itself is not attached to anything. By contrast, when Jesus says, "I'll build my church upon this rock," he says the word Petra, Petra is the way we would spell it. And that's a feminine noun that means something different than the masculine noun Petros. Petros refers to a boulder or a stone or a rock. But by contrast, Petra refers to a solid ledge of rock, like Mount Hermon. So the picture that Jesus is drawing here to illustrate when he says, I will build my church on this rock, is, Peter, you're like one of these boulders, one of these stones that we're walking past or we're walking on, and those are good things. But you know what? My kingdom's going to be built on the rock that you have just professed me as the Son of God. He's comparing the rocks along the way with Mount Hermon itself. And that's even more clear if you know that the Grotto of Pan was called by the Greeks and the people of the first century the gates of Hades. Our translations say the gates of hell. The Greek word there, when Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail against it, the Greek literally is the gates of Hades. The Hades referred to the underworld, the realm of the dead. It referred to Pan's grotto where they stood. So in essence, Jesus is drawing this mental picture saying that this hole in the ground is not about to swallow up my kingdom, which is represented by Mount Hermon. All of the corruption, all of the sin, all of the idolatry, all of the immorality going on at the base of this mountain can't even touch my kingdom. There's the mental image, comparing Mount Hermon to a hole in the ground. Now, the background of that metaphor is Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream back in Daniel chapter 2. Do you remember Nebuchadnezzar had a dream? He dreamed about this huge image, and the image was made of different metals. There was a part of gold and part of silver and part of bronze and part of iron, and then that iron turns into iron and clay. And that, Daniel explains, represents 4 successive empires. And the first is Babylon, represented by Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold. And following Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian empire is the Medo-Persian Empire, known historically as the Achaemenid Empire. And that empire is depicted as silver. And then there's that Greek empire of Alexander the Great that's depicted by the bronze. And then there's the Roman Republic, which is the iron. And then below that, the Roman Empire, the iron and clay. Now, in that particular dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a rock that strikes the image in its feet and shatters the entire image. And when Daniel explains that, he says, in fact, when that rock strikes the image and shatters it at the feet and shatters the image, then that rock becomes a mountain. And when Daniel explains it, he says this in Daniel 2:44. In the days of those kings, which is that last empire, the Roman Empire, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Now there's the background of the image that Jesus is putting in the minds of the disciples. It was in the days of the Roman Empire that Jesus established his eternal kingdom, the church. And he said, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. One of my favorite Christian writers is C.S. Lewis. And he has something to say about Jesus' claims. He says, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. In short, what C.S. Lewis is saying, Jesus was either a liar, or he was a lunatic, or he was and is Lord of all. Well, that's what Caesarea Philippi is all about. Next Sunday, I hope you'll join us as we take a look at the place Jesus made the center of his ministry for 2/3 of his ministry, Capernaum. A wonderful place, and I hope you'll be with us for the study. Thanks for listening.